Here we can see a traditional photographic lineup. However, there are a few aspects of the setup here that psychological research has identified as being problematic. Before we talk about those issues, I'm going to ask you to imagine that you're the eyewitness to the crime that we've shown in our drama. Imagine you've been called to the lineup, and we'll see if you can pick out the perpetrator of the crime. So, which of these individuals committed the crime? Maybe pause the video at this point so you can decide on your answer. Start the video again when you've decided. So we'll come back to see whether you got the correct answer later. Let's look at how this lineup was carried out and what psychological research has identified as being problematic with this way of doing things. The first issue is that the administrator knew in advance who the suspect was. This is known as a single blind procedure where only the eyewitness doesn't know in advance who the suspect is. The problem with this is that even with the best intentions in the world, it's possible that the administrator might accidentally provide cues to the eyewitness as to which person is the suspect. That is, the eyewitness might end up choosing the suspect not because they saw them committing the crime, where of course the suspect might be innocent, but because they've been subtly tipped off by the administrator as to who to pick. The administrator isn't necessarily doing this deliberately. The cues they're providing may be involuntary. Sarah Greathouse and Margaret Covera of the City University of New York found that situations in which the administrator knew who the suspect was did indeed lead to increased false identifications of the suspect as being the criminal. So, what's the solution? The solution is to employ what's known as a double-blind procedure, where you ensure that the administrator doesn't know who the suspect is. That is, you essentially treat the lineup as if you were running a behavioural experiment. Sarah Greathouse and Margaret Covera found that what they call the diagnosticity of the eyewitness, essentially a measure of how accurate their overall judgment was, doubled when the administrator didn't know who the suspect was, when the double-blind procedure was used. That is, we've got evidence that the double-blind procedure leads to better outcomes. The next issue that I'm going to talk about is related to the first. Greathouse and Covera found that the administrators who knew who the suspect was also performed a higher proportion of what they called biasing behaviours. Biasing behaviours refer to anything that the administrator does that might prejudice the eyewitness towards identifying the suspect, remembering that the suspect may, of course, be innocent. However, even when the administrator doesn't know who the suspect is, bias can still be introduced through the instructions that are given to the eyewitness. For example, it's likely that the eyewitness will assume, given the police have bothered with a lineup in the first place, that there's a good chance that the perpetrator is present. That is, their judgment will be coloured by the expectation that the criminal is somewhere in the lineup, and their job is to choose the person in the lineup who most closely resembles the criminal. In fact, Lorraine Hope of the University of Portsmouth and her colleagues report evidence that 90% of eyewitnesses in a simulated lineup situation expected the suspect to be in the lineup. So, how should we deal with this? Fortunately, this is one problem for which there appears to be an easy solution. It turns out that simply instructing the witness that the person they saw committing the crime may or may not be present in the lineup is sufficient to undermine this expectation and substantially reduce the chance of a false identification. In a classic study by Roy Malpass and Patricia Devine of the State University of New York, they compared the effect of biased and unbiased instructions to eyewitnesses on the percentage of judgment errors in a lineup situation. So, the unbiased instructions included reminding people that the person they saw committing the crime may or may not be in the lineup. They found that when the suspect was in the lineup, it didn't seem to matter whether biased or unbiased instructions were given. Eyewitnesses were pretty similar in their chances of correctly IDing the criminal. However, when the criminal was not in the lineup, an innocent person was identified as a criminal nearly 80% of the time. This compares with only 33% of eyewitnesses who had received the unbiased instructions. This finding has been confirmed by plenty of other studies since then, though I should point out that a point of contention here was raised by Stephen Clark of the University of California, Riverside. He argued that, based on a meta-analysis, there was evidence that biased instructions might increase correct IDs when a perpetrator is in a lineup. One way of conceptualizing what Clark is arguing is by showing the outcomes in a 2x2 contingency table. Here we can see the 4 possible outcomes of a lineup. 2 are good. There's a correct ID, so the criminal is in the lineup and the eyewitness correctly identifies them as the criminal. There's the correct lack of ID, whether the suspect in the lineup is innocent and the eyewitness correctly does not indicate that they are the criminal. The other 2 options are bad. There's a false ID where the suspect in the lineup is innocent, but the eyewitness incorrectly identifies them as the criminal. Finally, there's an incorrect failure to ID where the criminal is in the lineup, but the eyewitness fails to identify them. So, biased instructions where the eyewitness believes the perpetrator is in the lineup have the effect of increasing false IDs, meaning that we increase the chance of an innocent person being identified as the criminal. That is, we're moving judgments from this box to this box. However, Clark argues that in principle, biased instructions would also have the effect of increasing the chance of a correct ID if the criminal is actually in the lineup. We're essentially moving judgments from this box to this box. To put it another way, the instructions are affecting what we call the response bias of the eyewitness, making them more likely to identify the suspect as the criminal. That is, all judgments are being moved from the bottom row to the top row. This is good if the suspect really is the criminal, but bad if the suspect is actually innocent. Stephen Clark argued that his analysis, in contrast to previous analyses, confirmed this theory. That is, biased instructions can be both good and bad. So, does this mean that it's okay to use biased instructions under the right circumstances? Well, no. The problem, of course, is that in real life, you could never be sure that the perpetrator was actually in the lineup. So, by using biased instructions, you're always risking sending an innocent person to prison. So, even Stephen Clark's conclusion is that police should still always use unbiased instructions, despite the understandable temptation to do otherwise if the officers involved are convinced that they have the right person. So what we have here is some disagreement between researchers as to the underlying mechanisms, which is valuable in understanding what is actually going on, but the end result is that they still agree on what best practice ought to be. In the next presentation, we'll turn our attention to how the members of the lineup are presented to the eyewitness.